This is why theater in Europe is far more important to the people of Europe than theater in Canada. My name is Michael Rubenfeld. I am a theater artist, lifelong. I spent most of my adult career making and producing theater in Canada as an actor, as a playwright, as a director, and as a producer of festivals, including the Summerworks Festival. And then I moved to Poland, where I've been for the good part of 8 years. And in the past few years, I've gotten more involved in the theater scene in Poland, and I've learned a lot about the system here. And this is what I understand as to why the system is just frankly better. The biggest problem that I see in Canada is that it's very difficult to build culture. For culture to be important to people, they need to be able to access it. The system in Canada makes it almost impossible for people to access culture. What does that mean? Well, very simply, it means that people have no idea generally what is happening in the theater. Why is that? Because theaters have seasons. They run shows for 3-4 weeks. They generally don't have much of a marketing budget unless you're a commercial theater like Mirvish. Without a marketing budget, it is impossible to make enough noise for people of the city of, say, Toronto, to be able to even know what's happening in a theater like, say, Factory Theater or Theater Passe Muraille. So, in the absence of this marketing budget, what are these theaters relying on in order for audiences to hear about the show? Word of mouth, or articles written about them, or if you are a season-based theater, then I suppose you can get people to sign up for your season, which is something that more and more people have no interest in doing. Now, the problem is that because shows open for between 2 to 4 weeks, there's almost no time for there to be word of mouth. So even if somebody wants to see a show, they're never going to hear about it. So that's a problem. Secondly, there's almost no reviewers anymore in Canada. And so people can't rely on reviewers. So if you've got no reviewers and your shows aren't running long enough to gather word of mouth, and you don't have enough money to market your shows, how are you going to get people to even hear about the theater, never mind decide about coming? It's a huge problem, and I think part of the problem is that in Canada we've adopted the system that's used in the UK. It's still a problematic system, but the UK has hundreds and hundreds of years of understanding, respecting, and being interested in the theater. It has huge institutions like the National Theatre, the Young Vic, the Old Vic. I'm just talking about London companies, the Royal Court. The system that Canada uses is a system that was given by its colonizers, the United Kingdom. It's a system that started in like the 1950s in Canada, and it was never a system that really ever was going to work properly in Canada because we don't have a history of theater culture in Canada the way that they do in the UK. So in the UK, people are already kind of preordained to want to go to the theater, but that doesn't exist in Canada. Most people have or have never had interest in the theater. And so it's the theater's job in Canada, with a problematic system, to start teaching people who have never cared about the theater why they should care about the theater without a marketing budget and without really a way to let people know about the theater. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's always going to be a problem. People try and do clever social media things, but I'm sorry, I just don't think that the people who go to the theater, or who can afford to go to the theater, because let's face it, like $30, $40 minimum price ticket for the theater is expensive for the majority of people who are on social media, who are like kids under 30, and they tend to go to the movies, which are cheaper than the theater with much larger marketing budgets. Now, in Poland, there is a repertory system, which means that when a show is created, it goes into the repertory of the theater. That means that instead of just running the show for 3 weeks and then closing it forever and ever, amen, the show goes into the repertory, meaning that it continues to run for several years until the show is no longer interesting to an audience. But by continuing to run a show for several years, the show allows itself to find an audience. A show won't run ever for like more than 4 or 5 performances at a time. It will premiere, you run for 5 performances, and then it'll go into storage for a couple of months, and then it'll come back again, and then it'll go back into storage, and it'll just kind of go like this for a while. The first year, it will play more often because it's a newer show. But then at a certain point, the show has been played for a year, 2 years. People will have heard about the show. The people of that town will have heard about the show because people will have talked about the show. If the show is an interesting show for a public, then it will find a public because it will be given the time to find a public. This makes a lot of sense to me. There are seasons in Poland, but there's nothing like seasons tickets. And honestly, they don't decide what the entire season is going to be ahead of time. They will program shows according to their degree of popularity. Again, makes sense, right? So you're able to then start to build a culture around shows. So if a show is liked, then people will talk about why they like it, and then other people will go to the show because they've heard about it. In Canada, what happens? Most of the time, hey, I saw a show that I liked. You would really like it. Too bad it closed 3 weeks ago, because that's the system in Canada. I'm sorry, but it's just not possible to grow culture this way. And I don't know what to do other than to try to find a way to change it. There's a lot of problems like equity and storage space, and that's just not how we do things. But the fact is that if we start trying to find ways to continue to run the shows that people want to go and see, even shows that people sort of want to go and see can have lives. Sometimes the doozies need to close, just as they need to close in Poland as well. But, there are shows that will run for 5-6 years, and these aren't even the best of the best. They're just shows that can find an audience and do find an audience because they're given the time to find an audience. Canada, shows have no time to find an audience ever. The only person who's sort of like working with the system and making it work for them is Chris Abraham and Crow's Theatre. And, they're moving shows now from Crow's to Mervish, and it's a cool system. He's doing a good job of it. But, Chris Abraham is kind of like a mad scientist who can figure these things out. Not everyone can do that. So in my opinion, the system needs to be as such that several people and several theaters can operate within it. Whereas right now, there's a reason that Crow's Theatre is doing as well as it is. But I don't think that it should be like that. I think that more theaters can be healthier if there was a way to find a way to make a better system. That's my 2 cents for what it's worth.